Welcome back to Co-op Radio 102.7 FM CFRO. Kevin Annette is not going to be here today, so he said to me, Reg, can you fill in for me? And I said, of course, because I love to spend time with the listening audience here on Co-op Radio and bring on interesting guests. I said to Kevin, okay, I'll do it. So this show today is it's a special for Monday Brown Bagger in the sense that I get to continue informing the listening audience and bringing on interesting guests to enlighten us, to empower us, and to inform us. I mean, that's the most important thing about Co-op Radio that I love. It's alternative radio at its best. So I'd like to remind people that this will be archived on my website of angus-mcleod.com, McLeod spelled M-C-L-E-O-D. And Kevin may also archive this on his website of hiddenfromhistory.org. With that said, I'd now like to introduce our guest, who is the president of a political party here from British Columbia. It's called the Refederation Party, Dennis Shaw. Hello, Dennis.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, when I received your email through my emails on my website, and your Mike Summers also emailed me too, and they started... Because of the interview I did with Michael Frisby, I'm happy to see that there are people from British Columbia, Canadians, that are standing up and doing what Michael Frisby was suggesting that we do. And I was wondering, could you quickly tell our listening audience a little bit about your background, what brought you into this party here in British Columbia?
Well, my background is that I spent a few years in the military, and the rest of my life I was an elementary school teacher in Nanaimo. And somebody woke me up to the fact that things were not quite as they seem. So I started to read about what was going on in the world, and I realized that they were right. One thing I realized that we are in quite a constitutional mess in this country. And as a matter of fact, I'm not the only person saying that. There was a member of Parliament a few years ago who actually wrote a book, Canada, Country Without a Constitution. And so I researched it and wondered what we could do about it. And so I and two or three others co-founded the BC Refederation Party, which is designed to change the political system in BC in such a way that people are given the power. And that is the way it should be in a democracy, of course. The politicians should be the servants of the people. And right now we all know that politicians take no notice whatsoever of the people. And that is because the system, the way it's set up, allows them to do that. We have to change the system. So that's when we formed the Refederation Party, and we have researched a method for changing the system. It's very simple, but it's very powerful.
Yeah, and also what you were mentioning about our Constitution here in Canada, I know you and I had a gigantic conversation more than once. Could you actually quickly tell our listening audience a little bit about how the 1982 Constitution is an act of Parliament and is not done by the people?
Yes, that is the basic problem in this country. Canada has no constitution. And also, it is true to say that BC has no constitution, but we can come back to that in a short while. The Canadian situation is that this country used to be a colony of the United Kingdom, or Britain. And in 1931, that changed. The people of Canada became a sovereign people, and they were no longer ruled by the British. The situation at that stage, which was in 1931, the Statute of Westminster, the situation was that the day before, the Canadian government got its authority to govern this country from the British. The moment the British pulled out, the question is then, from where does the government of Canada get its authority to rule? Well, what should have happened is that the people should have exercise their, what they call their inherent right to choose their form of government in a democracy. They should have chosen the form of government. They should have been asked, and they should have voted on it. And it never happened. What did happen is that the very next day, after Canada became a sovereign nation, the government just carried on as it had before, but without any authority to govern, and has never asked the people for permission to govern them, which is what should happen in a democracy. The government right now has been operating from 1931 up till 1982, when Trudeau brought in the Constitution Act of 1982. And it's what they call repatriating the Constitution, which is a lot of nonsense. What they should have done was ask the people for authority to govern, and they never did. What they did was they wrote the Constitution Act, which is a statute. And the politicians passed this statute, and it set up the form of government for Canada, the way the politicians wanted it, gives them all the power, gives the people no power. It's as simple as that. And they refer to, everybody around us refers to the Constitution. There is no Constitution, because what they mean by that is the Constitution Act of 1982. And an act is simply a statute that has been passed by a bunch of politicians. A constitution, here, what is the definition of a constitution? The only definition of a constitution, there are several, the only one that gives democracy to the people is this, and it comes from the Black's Law Dictionary. A constitution is a charter of government deriving its whole authority from the people, from the governed. And if we had that, we would have a democracy. But of course we don't. We don't have a constitution. We're ruled by an act passed by the politicians to give all the power to the politicians and to make us obey the politicians. That's the situation in Canada.
So
we could go on and mention that the same situation applies in BC here, which is closer to home. What would you like to do?
I'd like to quickly, we can talk about the so-called alleged Constitution for BC that came in 1871 in a couple minutes. But what I wanted to talk about first was, so in 1960, when the Bill of Rights was passed by the Diefenbaker government, and 1982, when Trudeau brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which not only gave the Native Americans, recognized the Native Americans, allowed them to give them the right to vote, it recognized bilingualism in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So all of that stuff passed by our government actually is not a law at this time, because our government did not have the authority to pass it.
The government has never had authority from the people to govern, to pass laws. No. It's an incredible situation.
And also, you were telling me about over in Britain that the British Parliament created the British monarchy. Could we quickly talk about that? And then we'll get back over to BC and talk about the 1871.
Yes, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the Canadians are in the same boat. And in Australia, a group got together and queried their constitution too. They took it to England and took it through the law courts. And they were told by the British Privy Council that the English Queen is a creation of British legislation. And the Queen simply has to do what the British Parliament tells her, which is quite the opposite of what everybody believes. They think the Queen is the head of state, and therefore everybody obeys the Queen. It's not so. Another thing about the Queen of England is that for many, many years they've had a legal situation that says that the Queen is indivisible. That means that the Queen of England cannot be the Queen of any other country at the same time. However, recently they got in a bit of a tangle with that legal maxim, and so they decided to change it. This is what they do. When there's no written constitution, they can do what they like, right? So what they did was to change it. They now have decreed that the Queen is divisible, which means that she can be the Queen of Canada, which is what they say she is.
Was that over in Britain that did that, that changed it, or here in Canada?
That's the British Parliament. The British judicial system stated that the Queen is now divisible because it suits them that way. Now, the Queen is supposed to be the head of the Commonwealth, and Canada is a member of the Commonwealth. And therefore, people say, and they believe in Canada, that the Queen of England is the Queen of Canada. Well, just think about it for a moment. There is no person, physical person, who is a Queen of Canada. There isn't one. Also, there is no person or office that has been created by the Canadian Parliament which is called the Queen of Canada. There simply exists no Queen of Canada. However, what they do, to muddy the waters, they talk about the Crown. The Crown rules everything. If you go to court, it's you versus the Crown. And in that way, they push this idea that the Queen is the head of Canada. Let's go back to the Constitution Act, 1982, that Trudeau brought in. There are two parts to that. One is, as you just mentioned, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as they call it. The other part is the old BNA, the British North America Act, under which Canada was ruled until we became free from Britain. That BNA is still in effect today. You read the Constitution Act 1982, if you get a copy, you will see the first section is the BNA. It still applies. Now, in the BNA, the section dealing with the Governor General,
Section 12.
Section 12, exactly, was put in when Britain ruled Canada, and they ruled Canada with the aid of a Governor General. They were in Britain, or we were in Canada, and the Governor General was here, and he did what the Brits told him to do, and he ruled this country. Okay? That still applies today. That's in the BNA, and it's still in the Constitution Act 1982.
So
now, this section 12, it is the longest English sentence I've ever come across, and it is the hardest to understand. It'll take you half an hour to figure it out. But what it says after you've figured it out is that the Governor General of Canada has total power and authority over everything and everybody in Canada. Take my word for it.
So when they tried to dissolve Parliament and they tried to enter into that coalition with a Bloc and the NDP and the Liberals all got together, and it went to the Governor General. So when the Governor General refused to accept it and told Harper to go back and continue on with his minority government, that's when that Section 12 came into play. And if that's true, then what happens is, that is evidence enough to prove that our Constitution is nothing more than a piece of paper which doesn't exist. Yes,
the Governor General had every right to tell the Prime Minister what to do. It is a total comical farce, actually, because the Governor General is appointed by the Prime Minister. A lot of people don't know this. In the old days, the Governor General, when Britain ruled this country, the Governor General was appointed by a letter patent. There have been no letters patent signed by Britain since somewhere early in the 1900s. What happened is that around 1947, the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King then wanted to appoint a Governor General. But he could not get a letter patent from England because England no longer had anything to do with Canada. We were sovereign. And he solved the problem very simply. He wrote his own letter patent. You can find it on the web. I've got a copy in my house here. he wrote it saying that I appoint so-and-so to be Governor General of Canada. And he wrote it in such a way that it sounded as though the Brits had written it. It's rather a cunning piece of paper. And that started the system then of Canadian prime ministers appointing the Governor General on their own without the Brits. And that's what happens today. So we have the Prime Minister, who actually, in my opinion, is a total dictator and runs everything in Canada, appointing a Governor General under Section 12 who has total authority over Canada. What a mess. And the people have nothing to say about any of this.
So can I quickly get to 1871, this alleged BC Constitution, which you and I know is nothing more than a piece of paper, again, has no power to it. I had a chance to read through that because of my research that I've done on the massive corruption in regards to the mining issue here in British Columbia. Someone from the legislature actually emailed me a copy of this 1871 document. And when I had a chance to read through it, what it did was it sets the lieutenant governor up as every single bill that passes over in the legislature has to be handed over to him, and he rubber stamps it. And if he doesn't like anything, he can turn around, he can send it back and say, no, change the bill. So he's basically set up as the ultimate leader here in the province of British Columbia. Could you talk a little bit about the Lieutenant Governor, how he's appointed, and how this ties in with the Governor General?
It's exactly the same scene here in BC. In 1871, when we joined what was called the Confederation, incidentally, there has never been a Confederation, but if anybody can produce a document where all the provinces have given up powers to a central government to confederate, I would like to see it. However, that's by the way. In 1871, when we joined Confederation, the British were ruling us, of course, and they ruled us through the Governor General, who was in Ottawa. Now, in each province, as they joined, they created a lieutenant governor who obeyed the Governor General, who obeyed the Queen. That was the system. In 1871, they set up a council of British Columbians, but the lieutenant governor of BC was given total authority over the province, and they wrote a statute called the BC Constitution Act, which laid out the constitutional basis for this province. It was, however, an act, and to this day, we still have a BC Constitution Act, and it is very similar in the wording still. It's the same act. It's been amended over the years, but some of the wording is identical. And it still makes the Lieutenant Governor of BC the ultimate power in BC. On the BC Refederation Party website, which is refedbc.com, on that website is a short article giving the main points of the BC Constitution Act, showing that the Lieutenant Governor is the total power. He can hire and fire anybody in BC at will. He does not need to consult with anybody, he or she. That's still the same today. When a law is passed in the legislature, when an act is passed, it does not become law until it has the Lieutenant Governor's signature on it. So when the law is passed in the legislature, it goes up the road to the Lieutenant Governor, who signs it. The Lieutenant Governor has the power to say no, as you just mentioned. And he can send it back and keep sending it back. And the elected representatives of the British Columbian people can do nothing about this. And it's also a fact that no money, no actor of the legislature spending money is permitted until it has the Lieutenant Governor's signature, an agreement, before it's spent. Before the act is passed, they must get agreement from the Lieutenant Governor. It's all in the BC Constitution Act. And that's what rules BC today. Under it, it sets up a prime minister, and it gives him all the powers he wants that he has today. But if the lieutenant governor wants to disagree with the prime minister or the actions of the BC representatives, he can veto anything. He is appointed, I think is the right word, by the Canadian Parliament. He's certainly paid by the Canadian Parliament. And since he's paid by the Canadian Parliament, this will give you an idea that this is how the Canadian Parliament controls this province. That's one of the things we need to negotiate, which the BC Refederation Party is ready and willing to renegotiate.
Well, it looks like we're running. Our time is going by real fast, and there's some major points I really want to touch on, and we only have a couple minutes to do it. So I'd like to quickly touch on the three main policies that your party has at this time, and then we can also touch on how people can join your party, and also if how many people you've ran in the last election and the upcoming election as the years come by. But the three things that I noticed on your policies on your website in regards to your party was provincial constitution, direct democracy, and refederation, right? And with the direct democracy one, we've had a guest on in the past, former Senator Mike Gravel, who's actually talked about direct democracy initiatives. And when I had a chance to talk to Mike Summers, your leader of the party, last night, a lot of stuff that he was saying was stuff that Senator Gravel was talking about. So I'm hoping that one day I can connect up Senator Gravel with your representatives of your party. But could you quickly, in about, if you could take about 30 seconds just to quickly talk about your policies?
30 seconds. It can be done. The first and main policy is to clear up the constitutional mess. We will, let's say we took power next weekend. We would immediately write a constitution that puts the people in the driver's seat and put it to referendum. The people would accept it. In that constitution, they would retain to themselves the right to veto any government action. So they would then, in future, elect governments, tell them, go ahead, govern this province. Anytime the government got on the wrong track, there would be an automatic right to a referendum by the people, and they would veto it. That's the direct democracy element that we would add to the present system. And thirdly, we would then start to deal with Ottawa and all the problems with the jurisdictions between the central government and the provincial government.
Yeah, as I was talking to Mike Summers, he was also mentioning, and also you were mentioning to me too, none of this would be possible unless you get elected. So that's when the people out there, they'd have to get involved. And, there's so many people out there saying, they're complaining, saying, look, nothing's done. I'm not going to vote for anyone. I'm not interested anymore. So much apathy. But, here's a chance for the people of British Columbia to finally bring about positive change, because we're looking at, here's a party that's actually offering it. With that said, is there, can you again say your website and where people can actually go to look more closely at your policies and contact information? Because there's so much information that we could be covering. It's just take a couple hours alone just with your topics.
Okay, the website is the www.refedbc.com. Refed is short for Refederation. Now, Refederation means getting back to the original deal, by the way, when we confederated. We've got away from that. Phone numbers, my phone number they can note down is 250-758-2089. 758-2089. And in the last election, just before the last election, we've advertised this party for the first time. We've been 8 years organizing it, and just before the election, we advertised for the first time, and within 2 weeks, we had 50 nominee candidates apply. We could have run 50 candidates in the last election. Trouble was, it was all just a little bit too late. Most of them couldn't quite make the timing, and we ran 22 candidates. That makes us the fifth largest party in the province right now. And probably the way we're going now, we seem on track to run about 80 out of 85 candidates next election, because we're slowly becoming known. The media won't touch us, of course, because we're threatening the establishment as it stands today.
Yeah, Mike and I had a gigantic conversation yesterday, and he was telling me how there's certain media outlets that don't feel that they have to give people fair listening time when it comes to election time. But it's amazing how they talk about how each party's getting fair representation in regards to time on the radio, but when it comes all down to it, and you start to look at the time, the Liberals are getting the most, and then followed by the NDP, and then the other parties right after that one, the minor players are getting a lot more time than even your party was getting, because I didn't become aware of your party until you emailed me, and because of my interview I did with Michael Frisby, and you brought it to my attention that actually there are Canadians out there. There's people from British Columbia that are doing what Mr. Frisby was recommending, and I thank you so much for that email. And it's so great to see other people from BC finally looking at let's bring about positive change. And like I continue to tell people, only change can come through the people. That's the only change that can come, and it has to be through the people. That is democracy, because what I believe in democracy, I believe it is the people that that should come up with the laws, and it is the politicians who enforce the laws that the people have come up with. In other words, the politicians are not allowed to change the laws in any way, and this benefits the people and only the people, because the people are the employers and the politicians are the employees of the people, who should, if the politicians do anything that people don't like, not only should they be held accountable in the court of law for anything illegal that they've done, at the same time, I believe that we, the people, should have the right to fire them.
Exactly.
And I'd just like to remind our listening audience, Co-op Radio 102.7 FM, CFRO. This is Monday Brown Bagger. Thanks to Kevin and Annette for allowing us to have this time. And what we're going to do, I thank you so much for coming on today there, Dennis. That was Dennis Shaw, the president of the BC Refederation Party. Thank you so much for bringing your party to my attention. We're definitely going to have you come back on in the future. We're probably going to ask Mike to come on too, because there's so many different areas that we didn't touch on, which I feel that the people, our listening audience here in British Columbia and elsewhere, should listen to, because this is an idea that should go across Canada, is what I feel. But thank you so much there, Dennis. I'm getting my operator right now is really motioning me. She's starting to get a little bit tense, because she's saying that we have to move on to our next guest.
I'll say one more thing. You say spread across the country. There is the start of a Refederation Party in Alberta already. Just started last month. It's spreading.
Well,
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much there, Dennis.
Goodbye.